The dumpster behind the Ming Garden restaurant smelled like a combination of rotting cabbage and something animal that Sam had long since stopped trying to identify. He didn't gag anymore. That particular luxury, the ability to be offended by a smell, had vanished sometime around his second winter on the streets, the same winter he'd learned that cardboard, layered thick enough, could keep a person alive in temperatures that should have killed them. Sam dug methodically through the bin, his fingers working by feel more than sight. The alley was dark except for a distant street lamp that cast everything in a jaundiced yellow glow, and the November wind came screaming down the corridor between buildings with a kind of personal malice, targeting the gaps between his collar and his neck, the torn elbow of his jacket, the hole in his left sneaker where water had been getting in since October. He was 15 years old, and he moved like someone much older. His fingers closed around something promising, a takeout container, still faintly warm, the kind with the plastic window on top. He pulled it out and tilted it toward the street lamp. Half a portion of fried rice, still recognizable, the grease congealed but not green. His stomach made a sound that was somewhere between gratitude and desperation. "Find anything good?" Old Ben's voice came from the shadows beneath the fire escape, low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had made peace with waiting. Sam could make out the old man's silhouette, the broad, sloped shoulders, the knit cap pulled down to his eyebrows, the military surplus jacket that had seen better decades. Ben was 65 and looked 80 on bad days, younger than that only when he was telling stories about places he'd been and things he'd done before the war took something fundamental from him that he never got back. "Rice," Sam said, walking over and handing him the container. "Still okay, I think." Ben accepted it without ceremony, the way Sam had learned he accepted most things, without making a fuss, without false gratitude that would have felt condescending between them. He opened the lid, smelled it with the professional gravity of a sommelier, and nodded. "You eat. Found half a hot dog roll earlier." "I'm good." Ben gave him a look that said he wasn't fooled but wouldn't push it. He scooped a portion of the rice into the container lid and held it out. Sam took it. They ate in silence for a moment, shoulder to shoulder against the cold brick wall, and Sam felt, as he often did in these quiet pockets with the old man, something dangerously close to peace. Ben had found him 11 months ago, shivering and half delirious behind a bus station, and had walked him through the invisible geography of survival in the city, which shelters to avoid, most of them, which church kitchens served without demanding prayers in return, which cops looked the other way, and which ones enjoyed their work too much. He'd taught Sam how to read a person's threat level in 2 seconds flat, how to sleep lightly enough to hear footsteps, how to make himself small and forgettable in a crowd. "They were on Morrison Street this afternoon," Ben said quietly. He didn't need to specify who. Sam's jaw tightened. He kept eating. "How many?" 6, 7. Viper and the regulars. A pause. "They had someone's dog." "A big one." "Whose?" "Didn't recognize it." Ben scraped the last of the rice from the container. "Big, brindle. Looked like a pit bull mix. Something valuable." Before Sam could respond, the alley filled with sound, boots on wet asphalt, the hollow percussion of a bottle kicked against a wall, laughter that had glass in it. Sam was on his feet before conscious thought kicked in, years of street instinct moving his body independently of his brain. Ben was slower, age and old wounds making him deliberate, and that half-second was enough. They came around the corner in a loose pack, 6 of them, ranging from 17 to 20, wearing the red and black bandanas that marked the serpents, what most of the neighborhood called the Snake Boys, though Viper himself preferred to hear it as the Vipers, which was close enough to his own street name that it stroked something in him. At the center was Viper himself. 19 years old, lean and wiry with the compacted energy of something that had been cruel for so long it no longer required effort. He had a face that might have been almost handsome in different circumstances, now just sharp and knowing in the way of someone who has never once been held accountable for anything. "Well, look at this." Viper's voice was conversational, which was always worse than when it was loud. "Dinner with Grandpa." Sam put himself slightly in front of Ben. He didn't do it consciously. His body just made the decision. One of the serpents, a heavy-set kid called Truck, pushed Ben hard against the wall and dug through his pockets, coming out with a handful of change. Less than $2. He held it up like a trophy. "This everything you got, old man?" "Don't," Sam said. The word came out before he could stop it. Viper turned to look at him with the slow interest of a cat who has just noticed a mouse attempting dignity. "Don't," he repeated, savoring it. "Did the little ditch rat just say don't to me?" What happened next was brief and comprehensive. Sam took the first hit across the shoulder blades, stumbling forward, and then two of them had his arms, and the rest was pain measured out in specific locations: ribs, stomach, the side of his head above the ear. He didn't cry out. He'd learned that silence was the only form of defiance available to him in these moments, the only thing they couldn't take. When it was over and they'd walked away, counting the stolen change and laughing, Sam lay on the wet asphalt and breathed carefully and waited for the worst of it to pass. Ben knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow. But he stayed there, warm and solid, until Sam was ready to sit up. "You didn't have to do that," Ben said finally. "I know," Sam said. Neither of them mentioned that he'd do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that. It was simply who he was, a fact about him as fixed and immovable as his eye color or the shape of his hands. Even here, at the bottom of everything, with nothing and no one, he couldn't make himself into something smaller. The Blackwater River earned its name from the sediment that darkened it to the color of strong tea, though in November, with the snowmelt from the mountains upstream running cold and fast through the city's industrial corridor, it looked closer to black iron. The abandoned freight docks along its eastern bank were serpent territory by default, the kind of desolate infrastructure that only mattered to people who needed space no one was watching. Sam had come that way not by choice, but by necessity. The shelter on Fifth had a 3-day wait list, and he needed somewhere out of the wind, and the old drainage tunnel beneath the dock road offered that, barely. He moved quietly, which was something he was very good at. He was halfway along the dock wall when he heard the sounds from the far end of the wharf. He stopped. Laughter. The hollow thud of a boot making contact with something that yelped. Then another yelp, higher, more frightened. Sam pressed himself against the rusted wall and peered around the corner. There were 5 of them on the dock's edge. Viper wasn't present. This was a subset, a pleasure outing, bored teenagers with no purpose and too much cruelty. They'd tied a rope around the neck of a large brindle pit bull, the dog Ben had mentioned. Sam registered distantly, and 2 of them held the rope while the others took turns kicking. The dog was massive through the chest, built like something architectural, but the kicks were staggering it, and there was blood already at its muzzle and along one side. Sam noticed something else. The dog had a collar with a thick metal tag that, even from this distance, caught the light in a way that suggested quality, weight, expense. Someone cared about this animal. Someone who could afford to care about an animal, which meant someone who was not nothing. He should leave. He knew he should leave. The risk-benefit calculation was not complicated. 5 serpents, a dog that wasn't his, no one who would thank him, or help him, or even know. He should slip back down the dock road and find his tunnel, and put his head down and survive the night, because survival was the project. Survival was the whole thing. The dog looked up. Not at Sam. It couldn't have known he was there. It looked up at the sky, or at nothing, with the expression of something that has stopped expecting rescue and is simply enduring. There was something in that look, that particular combination of pain and absolute absence of self-pity, that reached inside Sam's chest and grabbed something. Then one of the serpents held up a length of rope with a cinder block attached to the end, and the others started hooting with laughter. They began working the rope around the dog's neck. Sam's body moved before his thoughts caught up. He was out from behind the wall and running before he'd made any conscious decision to run, which was perhaps why the serpents didn't immediately react. He was just suddenly there, between them. And he'd grabbed the cinder block rope and was pulling against it with everything he had. It lasted approximately 4 seconds before 3 of them grabbed him and the other 2 finished tying the weight to the dog's collar. The beating was shorter and more efficient than last night's. They had a project to finish, and when they dragged him off the dog and threw him to the dock's edge, his head rang like a struck bell. "Stupid little idiot," one of them said, almost affectionately. "You want to go in after it?" They kicked the dog off the dock's edge. The splash was heavy and immediate, and then the current took it, not peacefully but violently, the black water pulling the dog under within seconds as the cinder block dragged it toward the channel. They didn't bother watching. They were already walking away, already on to the next thing, already laughing about something else. Sam heard their voices recede down the dock road. He looked at the river. The dog's head was still visible. Barely. Fighting. Its legs churning the dark water with everything it had while the rope and the block pulled it steadily down. The current was taking it along the bank, fast, toward the deeper channel and the bridge, maybe 20 feet downstream. Sam couldn't swim. He'd never learned. His childhood had not been the kind that included swimming lessons. He knew, in the abstract, that cold water at this temperature caused a physiological shock response that could stop a person's heart before they ever had the chance to drown. Ben had told him about this, about guys he'd known in winter training. What happened when the body simply refused? He pulled his jacket off, shoved the small folding knife he kept in his breast pocket into his jeans, sat down on the dock's edge, and dropped into the black water. The cold was not a temperature. It was a violence. A full-body assault so absolute that his first breath came out as a scream that the river swallowed immediately. His muscles locked. Every nerve in his body sent the same emergency signal: wrong, stop, wrong, stop. For a terrible second he was simply paralyzed, the current taking him, his body making no decisions at all. Then he saw the dog's head, still fighting, maybe 10 feet away. He started swimming in the way people swim who don't know how to swim, chaotic, desperate, burning energy 10 times faster than someone with technique, but moving. He moved. The river was carrying them both in the same direction, which was the only reason the distance didn't increase, and after what felt like several separate lifetimes, his hand found fur. He grabbed it. Fur and collar and rope. The dog went still for a moment, the absolute stillness of an animal making a decision, and then it stopped fighting the current and waited, trusting the thing that had grabbed it. Sam got the knife out. His hands were already failing, fingers turning into something that registered touch only approximately, like wearing thick gloves. He found the rope by feel, got the blade against it, and sawed. The blade was dull. Of course it was dull. He sawed harder, his legs kicking to keep them both at the surface, his lungs beginning to perform their own emergency calculations about air. The rope parted. The cinder block disappeared into the darkness below. Sam grabbed the dock's concrete support pylon with one arm and the dog with the other, and held on while the current tried to take them both, and he held on, and he held on, until his feet found something, a submerged ledge, an old support strut. And he was able to push up, get his elbow over the edge of the bank's concrete lip, and drag them both, inch by inch, out of the black water. He lay on the cold concrete under the bridge and could not move. The dog crawled to him. It pressed its massive, soaking body against his side and put its enormous head on his chest, and the heat of it, the surprising, impossible warmth of a living creature, was the only thing in the world. Sam put his arm around it and let his eyes close. He didn't lose consciousness completely. He lost time, which was different, patches of awareness and patches of nothing, like a radio signal breaking up and finding itself again. He was aware of the concrete beneath him, hard and unyielding. The wind under the bridge, which was less than the wind above the bridge, but still cold enough to be a problem. The dog beside him, occasionally lifting its head and licking at his face with rough, insistent strokes, as though it was trying to make him respond. "I'm here," he wanted to say. "I know. I'm here." He got moving because the cold was trying to kill him, and some part of his brain that was older than thought and purely animal understood that staying still was dying. He rolled onto his side, got to his hands and knees, stayed there for a long moment, shaking hard enough that his teeth chattered together in percussive, uncontrolled bursts. The dog stood with him. It shook itself, water flying, and then it pressed itself against Sam's legs from the side, bracing him, steady as a wall. Sam put his hand on its head. "Okay," he said, though his voice came out mostly air. "Okay. We're okay." They weren't okay. His lips were blue, and he couldn't feel 3 fingers on his right hand, and there was a cut on his cheekbone from the dock fight that had gotten grit into it. But they were above the waterline and they were breathing, and sometimes that had to be enough. He found a better position, deeper under the bridge where 2 sections of the support structure created a corner that blocked the worst of the wind. He discovered this spot months ago, had never used it because the drainage smell was bad, but now the drainage smell was irrelevant. He pulled his soaked jacket around himself despite it providing almost no warmth and curled into the corner, and the dog pressed in against him, not tentatively, not asking permission, just positioning itself with the calm certainty of an animal that has decided where it belongs. The dog's body heat was extraordinary. Sam had never owned a dog, never spent time with one. He hadn't known that a large animal could be a heat source this effective, this immediate. He pressed his face against the dog's thick neck and felt warmth begin to creep back into the parts of his face that had been going numb. He looked at the tag in the low light. The street lamp above the bridge filtered down through the expansion gaps in the concrete overhead, just enough to make out a name. Buster. And beneath it, a phone number, and beneath that, in all capitals, property of JX. Do not approach. Sam stared at those last 4 words for a long time. Do not approach. The kind of person who put that on their dog's tag was not the kind of person who filed a police report when their dog went missing. It was the kind of person who went looking themselves, in their own way. Sam had enough street sense to understand what that meant. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, the problem was hypothermia, and the solution to that problem was currently breathing slow and steady against his chest, one paw resting on his knee, already half asleep. Buster, Sam said softly. The dog opened one eye. You're going to be okay. Sam wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. The distinction didn't seem important. He pulled the dog closer, and the dog allowed it, adjusting its position to maximize the contact between them. And the 2 of them lay in the bridge's shadow while the river moved past outside, and the city made its indifferent sounds above them, and the cold came down slowly from the mountains, searching for anything alive to extinguish. Sam held on. Jax had not slept. This was not unusual for him. Sleep had been an unreliable country for most of his adult life, the kind of place you could visit but not trust, but tonight was different. Tonight was the 3rd night since Buster had disappeared, and the absence was a specific kind of wound that didn't respond to any of the things Jax normally used to manage wounds. His apartment above the clubhouse was large and almost completely empty in the way of a space that has never been intended as a home. A bed, a weight bench, a kitchen that had never been cooked in. The one exception to the functional spareness was the dog bed in the corner of the living room, an oversized memory foam thing that Buster treated with the dignity of a throne, that Jax had bought without any self-consciousness whatsoever. That was now empty in a way that made the whole room feel wrong. He stood at the window with a coffee that had gone cold and looked down at the street. Jax was 42 years old and had been a Hell's Angel for 20 of those years, an enforcer for the last 12. His body was a document of those years, scars that formed a rough topography across his forearms and collarbone, 3 broken bones that had healed slightly wrong, a left knee that predicted rain more reliably than any meteorologist. His face, which had been described by more than one person as the face of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen, was not a face that invited casual conversation. This suited him. Casual conversation was a need he'd largely outgrown. Buster was not a casual need. Buster was something else entirely. He'd pulled the dog from a fighting operation 6 years ago, a raid he hadn't been supposed to be involved in a county where he had no jurisdiction and no official reason to be present. The dog had been in a cage the size of a bathroom, covered in wounds, radiating the quiet fury of something that had been treated as a weapon for so long it had begun to believe that's all it was. Jax had looked at it and recognized something he didn't have words for, which was rare enough that he paid attention. He'd named it Buster because it seemed like the kind of name a dog should have, uncomplicated, unpretentious, honest. He'd spent 6 months proving to the animal that not everything with hands intended to cause pain. The dog had believed him eventually. Animals, in Jax's experience, were better than people at most things, including reading character. He'd left Buster in the yard for 4 hours on Monday while he dealt with club business. He'd come back and the gate had been opened from outside. The latch required specific knowledge, a lift and twist that nobody would stumble onto accidentally, and the yard was empty. Someone had taken his dog. Someone had known about the latch. Jax had spent 24 hours on this information before identifying a name through the network of people in this city who were afraid of him and therefore useful. A 19-year-old named Viper who ran a crew down by the freight docks, who had apparently acquired a large brindle pit bull that he was using for entertainment. The kind of entertainment Jax didn't want to think about too carefully. By Tuesday night, Jax had 8 members of the chapter with him, not the full complement, just the ones he could reach fast, and they moved through the streets in a black column of Harleys, engines reverberating off the brick walls of the industrial quarter like something geological. People who knew what the patches meant stepped back onto sidewalks without being asked. People who didn't know still moved, because moving away from that much noise and mass and intent was simply the correct mammalian response. They'd found the dog. No dog. Evidence of the dog, blood, fur, the frayed end of a rope attached to a cinder block at the dock's edge, floating at water level. Jax had stood there for a long time, very still, looking at the rope, looking at the water. One of his brothers, a mountain of a man called Reaper, had put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. They pulled serpents off the streets one by one through the night, extracting information in the way that Jax's particular reputation made efficient. The story assembled itself in pieces: the dog in the river, tied to a weight. A kid who'd jumped in after it. The kid and the dog last seen, maybe, near the bridges on the south side of the district. Jax had been sitting on his bike in front of the last person he'd spoken to, processing this. A kid. Someone had seen his dog drowning and gone in after it. He'd started his engine. South Bridge, he'd said. His voice was very calm in the way that only people who had learned to manage catastrophic rage could manage. We start there. Sam woke with a fever. He knew what fevers felt like. He'd had 2 serious ones in his time on the street, the second one bad enough that Ben had sat up with him for 18 hours, pressing cold wet rags to his forehead and keeping up a continuous low-voiced conversation about nothing in particular that had served the dual purpose of monitoring him and making him feel less alone. He recognized the particular wrongness of a feverish body, the way the air felt too hot and too cold simultaneously, the ache behind his eyes, the heaviness of his own limbs. Buster was still there. That was the first thing he checked. The dog was pressed against his legs, fully awake, watching him with an alertness that suggested it had been watching for some time. When Sam sat up, Buster shifted immediately to compensate, pressing into him from the side, offering ballast. Sam's hand went automatically to the dog's head. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough and his throat ached, which confirmed the fever was real and getting worse. He did a careful inventory of his body the way Ben had taught him, working from feet to head, noting what hurt and how much, distinguishing between the kind of hurt that healed and the kind that was a warning. His ribs on the right side were a problem. Breathing too deeply pulled at them in a way that made him think at least one might be cracked. His right knee had swollen inside his jeans. The cut on his cheekbone was warm to the touch and puffy, which meant it was infected or getting there. On the positive side, he was alive. Buster was alive. Both facts were, objectively, not guaranteed. He spent the morning in the bridge alcove, drifting in and out of something that was either light sleep or fever drift, while Buster kept a careful watch. The dog was alert to every sound: a pedestrian above on the bridge, pigeons landing, a delivery truck rumbling past, and its reaction to each told Sam whether it was worth waking for. When it relaxed, he could too. He found himself trusting the dog's judgment in a way that surprised him. By early afternoon, Buster was hungry. Sam knew this because the dog was pacing in the small space, its energy building, and also because Sam was hungry, and it seemed reasonable that the same processes applied. He had 63 cents. He counted it twice to make sure. The convenience store on Archer Street had a back door that opened to the service alley, and the overnight manager put the day-old items by that door at noon, not for theft purposes, just because the recycling bin was there. But the items were sometimes still in the shop's white bags, tied loosely, and sometimes a bag could fall off the pile without anyone noticing, or so Sam had reasoned on several previous occasions. He told Buster to stay, using the hand signal that turned out to work even though he'd invented it on the spot. The dog sat and watched him go with an expression of serious concern. He came back with 2 hot dog sausages from the gas station around the corner, the ones that had been rotating on the heating roller since probably 6 a.m. and were now more philosophical concept than food. He'd used 50 cents. He split them, giving Buster 1.5 and keeping half for himself. The dog ate with the focused, grateful efficiency of an animal that had known hunger, and then licked Sam's hand clean for several long seconds after. Sam sat against the concrete wall with the dog's head in his lap, running his fingers through the short brindle fur, and felt the fever press behind his eyes like something building pressure. He needed sleep. He needed antibiotics, probably. He needed several things he wasn't going to get. The sound of boots in the alley above the bridge embankment. Buster's head came up immediately, ears forward, body rigid. Sam went still. He heard a voice he recognized. Truck's voice. And then another and another. The serpents had found him. They came down the embankment in a loose line, 5, 6, 8 of them, and then Viper last, taking his time, the way authority presents itself as unhurried. Sam was on his feet before they reached the alcove, putting himself between the serpents and Buster, which accomplished nothing tactically, but was what his body insisted on doing. Viper stopped 10 feet away and looked at him with the particular expression of someone seeing something surprising. Then he saw the dog and his expression shifted into something colder. "That's not possible," he said. "The dog didn't drown," Sam said. His voice didn't shake, which he was mildly proud of. "I pulled it out." The silence that followed was brief and absolute. Then Viper laughed, a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it. He looked at the others and shook his head, as though marveling at the audacity of a universe that would allow something so absurd. "You jumped in after it. It wasn't a question. You jumped into the Blackwater in November." "I did." "You're a special kind of stupid." He took a step forward. "Or special kind of crazy. Which makes this easier." He looked at Truck. "Both of them." "Finish it." Buster growled. It was a sound from somewhere very deep and geological, a sound that was less a warning and more a statement of fact about consequences. Truck hesitated. "The dog's Jax's," someone said from the back of the group. Sam couldn't tell who, they were all starting to blur, but the name, and the tone in which it was delivered, had a visible effect on the group's forward momentum. "Shut up," Viper said, without turning around. "Jax doesn't know and won't know. It was an accident. The dog got loose, end of story." He looked at Sam with eyes that had made their final calculation. "But only if there are no witnesses." They came forward. Sam's back was to the concrete support column. He dropped to one knee over Buster and wrapped both arms around the dog, not because it was the tactically sensible thing, there was no tactically sensible thing, but because the dog had survived the river and the fighting pen and hadn't asked for any of this. And if there was one thing Sam was going to manage in whatever time he had, it was not letting go. The first kick took him in the ribs, the already damaged ones, and he folded around it, but held on. A boot connected with his shoulder and spun him sideways. Something metal hit the back of his head and his vision went white at the edges, narrowing. He heard Buster barking, not the deep warning bark, but something more desperate, more frightened, the sound of an animal watching the person it had decided to protect being destroyed and unable to stop it. Sam held on. He held on through the second impact and the third, and the concrete under his hands was gritty and cold, and somewhere in the narrowing white distance of his consciousness, he became aware that his hands were the last reliable thing, the place where he still had feeling, still had grip, still had purpose. Everything else could go. Not the grip. He didn't let go. And then the ground started shaking. It started as a vibration in the concrete, the kind of low-frequency trembling that precedes earthquake or heavy machinery, or something else that moves mass at speed. Sam felt it through his hands first, then his knees where they pressed against the ground. The serpents felt it too. The boots stopped. The sound came next, a deep, Rhythmic thunder that grew rapidly from distant to overwhelming, bouncing off the underside of the bridge above them, multiplied and reflected until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Engine sound. Many engines, running big and loud, the kind of exhaust note that is less a sound and more a physical force, something that you feel in your sternum before you process it with your ears. Buster went rigid in Sam's arms and then let out a sound that Sam had never heard an animal make, a howl that was simultaneously grief and recognition and something else, something that had no name, the sound of a creature calling to its own. Then headlights swept down the embankment, and the first motorcycle appeared at the bridge's eastern entrance, and then another, and then a dozen more, and then more after that, until the space under the bridge was flooded with engine noise and exhaust heat and the white-gold beams of headlights that turned the serpents into silhouettes standing in sudden, complete exposure. Sam squinted through the blood at his eyebrow and tried to count. He lost count at 20. The motorcycles arranged themselves with the unhurried certainty of a military formation, flanking left, flanking right, blocking the embankment exit. No panic. No rush. Just geometry. The kind of movement that communicates. There is no version of this where you leave on your own terms. The engines cut one by one until there were only two left idling. In the silence that followed, Sam could hear the river, and he could hear Buster, and he could hear the specific quality of 20-something young men understanding, perhaps for the first time in their lives, what it felt like to be genuinely afraid. One figure dismounted from the largest bike, a heavy, low-slung machine that looked like it had been assembled from darker materials than the others. The man who stepped off it was big in a way that went beyond physical dimensions, big in the way of someone whose presence fills space that his body doesn't occupy. He moved with the economy of someone who had never had to prove a point by moving faster than was necessary. Jax. He walked through the headlight beams and his shadow was enormous on the concrete, and Sam, from his position on the ground, saw him stop and take in the scene with the stillness of someone who has learned to gather all information before making any move. His eyes moved from the serpents to Sam to Buster, and stayed on Buster. Buster lost its mind. The howling that came out of the dog was something Sam felt in his bones, a sound of reunion, so pure and desperate that it cut through the pain and the fever and the white noise in his head, and hit something much more fundamental. The dog was straining against Sam's arms, not to escape, but simply because its whole body needed to move toward that one person in the way that water moves toward the lowest point. Sam let go. Buster crossed the space between them in 2 seconds flat, hit Jax's legs like a freight train, and stood there with its whole rear end wagging, making sounds that had passed beyond language into something more essential. Jax crouched and put both hands on the dog's face and said something in a voice too low to carry, and Sam saw the set of the man's jaw and the angle of his head and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has lost enough to recognize it in others, that this person had been genuinely terrified of never seeing this animal again. Then Buster turned around and came back to Sam. It put its head on Sam's knee. It looked at Jax. Then it looked back at Sam. Jax watched this. His face was impossible to read, scar tissue and hard angles, a face that had learned not to volunteer information. But his eyes moved from the dog to the boy on the ground, to the blood at the boy's temple, to the way the boy was holding the dog even now, with the dog's head in his lap, automatic and instinctive, the way you hold something you've decided matters more than you do. Then he turned and looked at Viper. Viper, to his credit or possibly to his complete lack of self-preservation instinct, met his gaze. His jaw was set. He was not, Sam realized, capable of backing down even when backing down was the only possible path to survival. It was the one consistent thing about him. He could not retreat, could not yield, as if his entire identity was built on a foundation of never, ever being the one who looks away. Jax looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned to his brothers. He made a gesture. Small. Almost casual. 2 fingers extended and then curled. The men came off their bikes. There was no preamble. Jax's brothers moved with the efficiency of people who have done this before, not as a mob, not in the chaotic way of street fights where adrenaline and inexperience cause half the participants to get in each other's way, but as something more purposeful. They spread out in a way that eliminated avenues of retreat, that separated the serpents from each other methodically, that made it impossible for any individual to focus on anything but what was directly in front of him. The serpents made the mistake, or perhaps the only choice available to them, of fighting back. This lasted less time than it takes to describe. Truck swung first, which Sam could have told him was a critical error. The target he'd selected was a man called Church who stood 6'4" and had the particular stillness of someone who had absorbed many things in his life without being moved by any of them. Church stepped inside the swing so it went harmlessly past his ear, put his elbow into Truck's face, and Truck sat down heavily on the concrete and did not get up again. After that, the serpents stopped making choices and began simply experiencing consequences. Sam watched from the ground with Buster beside him, and he felt something complicated: relief, yes, but also the disorienting sensation of witnessing justice being administered in a form so direct and unmediated that it bypassed every system designed to make such things abstract and impersonal. No courts, no lawyers, no careful calibration of what the law would or wouldn't address. Just, you did this, and so this happens to you. He watched two of Viper's crew break away and sprint for the embankment exit, reach it, and find it blocked by two motorcycles and two large men who turned them around with a minimum of ceremony. He watched another one get to his knees and cover his head with his hands in a position of surrender that was honored immediately, the man above him stepping back, finished, because the point wasn't cruelty, the point was conclusion. Viper was last. He'd gotten clear of the initial engagement, had tried to use the confusion to put distance between himself and Jax, and for perhaps 30 seconds, it had looked like he might actually reach the other exit. Then he'd found it also blocked and he'd turned, and there was Jax, walking toward him with the same unhurried pace he'd walked with since getting off his bike. Viper did not look like himself. The thing that had made him what he was, the ease of cruelty, the confidence of someone who had never encountered a consequence commensurate with his actions, was entirely gone. What was left was a 19-year-old boy facing something he didn't have the tools to process, and it showed in every line of him. He tried to talk. Words came out: territory, misunderstanding, accident, the dog, didn't know. Jax stopped 2 feet from him. He looked down at Viper, not because of height difference, though there was one, but because of something else. A specific quality of presence that makes some people feel looked down upon regardless of geometry. The dog, Jax said. His voice was low and flat, stripped of inflection, the voice of someone not performing anything. You tied a cinder block to my dog and threw him in the river. It was just. And that kid. His gaze moved to Sam for a moment. That kid jumped in after him. Viper didn't answer. How old are you? Jax said. Viper blinked. Apparently this was not the question he'd been expecting. 19. 19 years old, and you never once, not once, learned what happens when you do what you want to whoever you want and don't think about what comes after. Jax shook his head slightly. That's a failure of education. What happened next was efficient and thorough and surgical in its specificity, a broken metacarpal in Viper's right hand, 2 in his left. Applied in a way that communicated with absolute clarity the difference between incidental damage and deliberate instruction. Viper's howl under the bridge was high and genuine, and nothing like the voice he used when he was in charge. When it was over, Jax stood up and looked at the assembled serpents, some standing, some not, all in various states of understanding. He spoke clearly enough that everyone present could hear. You don't come back to this district. You don't come back to this bridge. You don't come near anything that's under my roof. A pause. You tell every crew in this city what happened here tonight when someone makes the choice you made. And if I hear your name again, he looked at Viper specifically, you won't have to think about what happens next. He turned and walked back to Sam. Sam watched him come. Even in his state, the fever making everything slightly unreal, the ribs making every breath an exercise in precision, the blood on his face dried to a tacky crust, he was aware enough to feel something spike in his chest as the large scarred man walked toward him. He tightened his arms around Buster instinctively. Whatever this was, whatever the debt was now, whatever claim was being established, Sam was prepared to argue it. He'd had a lifetime of people arriving to take things, and his body read the approach of authority as threat regardless of context. Buster felt him tense. The dog pushed its head more firmly into his lap and made a low sound, something between a whine and a rumble that was clearly addressed to Sam. Jax stopped 3 feet away and crouched down to their level, which was not what Sam had expected. The man was large and scarred and dressed in a cut covered in patches that represented 20 years of a particular kind of life, and he had just administered a degree of violence that Sam was still processing. And he crouched down in the blood-smeared concrete in front of a shaking 15-year-old who was refusing to let go of his dog, and he looked at him with an expression that had no threat in it at all. "How bad are you hurt?" he said. Sam's jaw worked. "I'm fine." One of Jax's brothers, standing behind him, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Jax looked at the cut on Sam's cheekbone, the swelling at his temple, the way Sam was breathing in the short, careful increments of someone protecting damaged ribs. His expression didn't change, but something moved through it. "You jumped in the river after my dog. He was drowning. You jumped in the Blackwater in November. Can you swim?" A pause. "No." Jax was quiet for a moment. He looked at Buster, who was now dividing its attention between Jax's face and Sam's face with the focused intensity of an animal trying to communicate something it doesn't have words for. The dog put one paw on Sam's knee and kept it there, looking at Jax. "He doesn't do that," Jax said quietly, almost to himself. "He doesn't lay on people he doesn't know." "He was cold," Sam said. Then, before he could stop himself, "We both were. It was practical." Jax looked at him for a long moment. Sam held the look because he'd been taught by the streets that breaking eye contact was the first surrender, and he'd gotten fairly practiced at not surrendering. "You're burning up," Jax said. "I'm fine." "You've been saying that." "Because it's true. You have a fever. You've got a cracked rib, probably more than one. The cut on your face is infected." He said these things without drama, just enumeration, the way you take stock of a situation before deciding what to do about it. "What's your name?" Silence. "I'm not going to do anything with your name except use it," Jax said. "I'm not a cop. I'm not social services. I'm not anything you need to worry about in that direction." Sam weighed this. The man was sitting on the concrete of a bridge underpass next to 24 motorcycles, having just methodically demolished a street gang that had been terrorizing the district for 3 years. And the most alarming thing about him at this particular moment was that he seemed entirely serious about not being a threat. "Sam," he said. Jax nodded. "Jax." He reached out and put a hand on Buster's head. Buster leaned into it and whined softly. "He's been looking for you since Monday," Jax said to the dog, and the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to the animal was so at odds with everything else Sam had witnessed that it was disorienting. The same hands that had just broken a teenager's bones were moving through the dog's fur with complete and unperformed tenderness. Then Jax looked at Sam again. "How long have you been out here?" Sam said nothing. "How old are you?" 15. Jax absorbed this. His jaw shifted once, a small movement. "You got anywhere to go?" This question, the specific architecture of it, the way it existed as a question and not an assumption, was enough to loosen something in Sam's chest that had been wiretight for a very long time. He felt it go and didn't know what to do about the feeling that replaced it. "No," he said. The word was very simple. Jax stood. He reached up and shrugged off his leather cut, the vest covered in patches, the one that meant everything about who he was in this city's hierarchy, and he handed it to Church without a word. Then he pulled off the heavy leather jacket underneath, and there was a moment where the cold air hit him and he seemed not to notice, because the jacket was already going around Sam's shoulders before the moment could extend further. The leather was warm with the man's body heat. It smelled of engine oil and tobacco and something underneath those things that was just warmth, just occupied warmth, the smell of something that had been worn close to a living body for a long time. Sam felt it settle over his shoulders, and the fever cold that had been eating at him receded 1 degree. He didn't say thank you. He couldn't find the words for what he felt, which was something larger and more complicated than gratitude, something that touched on a grief he'd been carrying for 2 years for the specific, concrete loss of being known by someone. Buster licked his face. Okay, Jack said. He reached down and picked Sam up, just lifted him, straightforwardly, the way you pick up someone who needs to be picked up and has run out of the ability to object, and carried him toward the largest motorcycle. Buster trotted at their heels, tail moving with the authority of someone who knows exactly how this ends. Where are we going? Sam asked. Somewhere warm, Jack said. Somewhere you don't have to sleep with one ear open. He set Sam on the motorcycle in front of him and started the engine, and the rumble of it was enormous and low and resonant, and underneath Sam's exhaustion and pain it felt, improbably, impossibly, like safety. The Hells Angels chapter clubhouse was a converted warehouse on the north side of the district, a building that from the outside communicated with its brick facade and steel-shuttered windows everything that anyone needed to know about whether they were welcome inside. Sam had walked past it twice in his months on the streets, understanding intuitively that it occupied a category separate from other off-limits places, not just dangerous but complete. Its own contained world with its own rules that intersected the visible city only at certain specific points. The inside was warmer than he'd expected. There was a common room with mismatched furniture arranged around a stone fireplace that was currently doing serious work against the November cold. A kitchen counter along one wall, coffee brewing, someone's boots drying near the radiator. Several of the chapter members were already there when they arrived, and there was a brief, efficient flurry of activity at Sam's appearance. A first aid kit materialized, someone who turned out to have genuine medical training. An ex-Navy corpsman who went by Doc and maintained this as his primary value to the chapter, examined Sam's ribs, cleaned the cut on his face, and delivered a verdict in the tone of a professional who is being precise rather than alarming. 2 cracked ribs. 1 possibly fractured. A wound that needed professional antibiotics, but could be managed through tonight with what they had. A fever that needed monitoring and fluids and sleep in that order. Sam sat on a bar stool and let this happen to him, which was its own small miracle, the letting. The not flinching. The ability to sit still while people moved around him with purposeful attention and accept that none of it was a prelude to something bad. Buster sat on his foot the entire time. At some point, he couldn't have said exactly when the transition happened, Sam became aware that he was warm throughout his body, not just on the surface, warm in the specific way that means warmth has reached the deeper places where cold had been sitting for hours. He was holding a mug of something that was hot and sweet and had been placed in his hands by a woman with silver-streaked hair and a fierce, no-nonsense face who'd been introduced as Maggie and who had looked at Sam with an expression that contained no calculation whatsoever, just clear-eyed assessment followed by a decision to feed him. Jax was at the other end of the room, talking to 2 of his brothers in the low, abbreviated way of men conducting necessary business, but Sam noticed that he kept his position oriented so that Sam was in his line of sight, not watching over him in a way that felt like surveillance. More like the way a person sits in a room when something matters to them, and they don't want to be too far from it. The fever began to break around midnight. Sam could feel it lift gradually, the way fog thins, still present, but no longer pressing on every surface. Doc made him drink 2 more glasses of water and checked his ribs again and told him the fracture was going to be uncomfortable for 4 to 6 weeks, and that he should avoid any further incidents of being used as a punching bag. I'll try to arrange that, Sam said. Doc gave him a look that suggested he found 15-year-olds with this quality of dry humor either impressive or exhausting, possibly both. Jax came and sat across from him while the room gradually quieted around them, the brothers dispersing to their respective corners of the building. Buster moved from Sam's foot to the space between them, resting its chin on Jax's knee while keeping one eye firmly on Sam, maintaining connection to both of them simultaneously with the efficiency of an animal that has decided it has a position and intends to hold it. You want to tell me about yourself? Jax said. Sam turned the mug in his hands. Not particularly. Fair. He scratched Buster behind the ears. I'll tell you something then. When I found Buster, he was in a cage the size of a closet, covered in wounds. He was trained to be afraid of people who weren't trying to hurt him and trust people who were, which is about as thorough a corruption of a decent animal's nature as you can manage. A pause. Took about 6 months before he'd sleep without waking up every hour. Sam was quiet. First night I brought him here, Jax continued. He stayed in the corner. Wouldn't come near anyone. Watched everything with this look, like he was trying to calculate who was going to do what and when. He looked at Sam. You've got that same look. Sam didn't answer. He looked down at the dog, who looked back at him with its amber eyes, steady, uncomplicated, profoundly present. I know you're not looking for a guardian, Jax said. I know you've been taking care of yourself for long enough that being taken care of probably feels like a trap. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm not asking you to trust me. Trust takes time. But I'm asking you to consider that you don't have to be outside tonight. Or tomorrow night. Or after that. Sam looked at him. Why? Because you jumped into a frozen river to save my dog when you didn't know how to swim, when there was nobody watching and nothing in it for you. Because you're 15 years old and you've got cracked ribs and a fever, and you still held onto that dog when 8 guys were hitting you with metal pipes. Jax's voice was even throughout this, each word just a weight being placed on a scale. Because you're the kind of person this city grinds down and makes nothing of, and I'd rather that didn't happen. The fire popped in the grate. Outside, faintly, the wind moved through the streets that Sam had been sleeping in for 11 months. There's a room in the back, Jax said. It's got a door that locks from the inside. Nobody in this building touches anything of mine without asking, including that room. You can use it tonight, and if you decide in the morning that you want to leave, I'll drive you wherever you want to go, and we'll call it even. He stood up. Or you can stay. He walked to the back of the room without waiting for an answer, because it wasn't a question that needed answering right now. It was just a fact being laid out, a set of coordinates, a position Sam could orient himself relative to when he was ready. Buster looked up at Sam. Sam looked back at the dog. The dog's expression, as always, was more readable than the human's, direct and complete, containing no subtext, no reservation, no fine print. It said, simply, I know exactly where I am and exactly who I'm with, and I am not afraid. Sam thought about old Ben. Tomorrow, before anything else, he would find Ben and tell him where he was. He'd drag the old man here if he had to. He had a feeling that Jax's particular form of hospitality had enough room in it for a 65-year-old veteran who had once talked a feverish 15-year-old through a bad night by talking about nothing for 18 hours straight. He thought about the river. The cold, and the rope, and the moment when it had occurred to him that he might not come back up, and the way that in the face of that possibility, the thing he'd been most concerned about was the dog going down into the dark alone. He thought about Viper and his crew somewhere in the city tonight, injured and finished and finally stopped, and how the satisfaction he'd expected to feel about this was quieter than he'd imagined. Less triumph and more simply the absence of a weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what it was like to walk without it. He looked around the room, the firelight, the smell of coffee and warm leather, the sound of men in adjacent rooms moving through their lives, the dog at his feet. The jacket that was still around his shoulders and smelled of someone who existed in this world with absolute certainty of their place in it. Sam took a breath. It caught on the cracked ribs and he exhaled carefully and took another one. He stood up. Buster stood with him, tail moving. He followed Jax toward the back of the building. In the morning, the sun came through the east-facing window of the small room and landed on a narrow bed and a 15-year-old boy who was sleeping deeply. The first real sleep he'd had in months, the sleep of someone who has, even tentatively, even with full awareness of how quickly things can change, allowed themselves to feel safe. The leather jacket was folded on the floor beside the bed. Buster was asleep across the foot of the mattress, radiating heat, one ear twitching occasionally in response to sounds from the street outside. The world had not changed overnight. The city was still the city, all its cruelties and its margins and its grinding indifference to anyone occupying its lowest floors. There were still people sleeping in the cold and men who took what they wanted and all the machinery of suffering that grinds on without pause or apology. But in this room, at this moment, a boy breathed in and out, whole and warming, and a dog dreamed at his feet, and somewhere down the hall a large scarred man sat with his morning coffee and did not feel the specific emptiness that had been with him since Monday. The absence that had been so vast and inexplicable that even people who'd known him for 20 years had been alarmed by what it had made of him. Buster had come home, and he'd brought someone with him. Some things were simple, in the end. Not easy, almost never easy, but simple. A hand in the water. A rope cut through. A jacket given. A door left unlocked. Sam slept, and the November sun climbed higher, and outside the window the city made its continuous noise, vast and impersonal and not, for the first time in a long time, aimed at him.